All right, so I guess let's make a start to this. So thanks everyone for coming to this talk. It's Building Healthier Cities, Reducing Air Pollution. We're hosted by the NHBE. So the NHBE stands for Nature, Health, and the Built Environment. It's a it's a kind of a postdoc and graduate student research network that tries to promote discussion that allows us to understand and prepare for the challenges facing urban environments in the coming decades. We have this is the Oxford branch of it. We also have branches in Cambridge and Yale, and we're looking to expand elsewhere to kind of create this kind of community of discussions that can be hosted locally and then shared globally. So we also have a live stream of this event going out to at least Yale and I think also Cambridge as well. As a quick show of hands, who is here because of the NHBE organization? Great. Even better, many people are not, so welcome. I hope that this is a good introduction to the group and that you find it interesting and would like to know more at the end. You can talk to either myself, Sabrina, or Tom about that for the Oxford branch, at least. I will start by I'll just briefly introduce the speakers. So we have our first speaker is Dr. Claire Hempside. She's an independent research fellow at the Environmental Change Institute, and her research focuses mostly on the climate change impacts on health and urban climates. She'll be talking about the impact of air pollution and its effects on the UK population. We'll then move on to Catherine Newell, who is a final year DEFO student at the Nuffield Department for Public Health. Her research focuses on chronic and acute health effects of ambient air pollution in China, and she'll be looking at how data is collected and gathered in China and what kinds of, how we're addressing how we're addressing the problem of air pollution in China and low and middle income countries. And then finally we have Dr. Andy Hom, who's a lead urban health scientist at the George Institute for Global Health and the founder of the Healthy Cities Network. Andy's interests lie at the intersection of data science, geography, and public health, and we'll be looking at the impact of road closures in two case studies in the US and how that affected air quality and some of the other interesting side effects of that. For the people who are watching on the live stream, we apologize, there's about a minute delay on it. But if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to add them to the chat, and we'll go through them and we'll pick out some of the ones that we like and ask them during the question and answer section at the end. So I guess with that, I'll pass the presentation off to Claire and go.
So thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invite here today. As Dan said, I'm going to be talking mostly about the UK, air pollution in the UK. So although I'm at the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford now, previously I was at Public Health England, which is a government agency. So a lot of the work here is stuff that I've done when I was at Public Health England. So air pollution is not a new problem in the UK, but we talk about UK air pollution quite a lot. In the past, we used to burn a lot of coal, which led to scenes like this, and we had a number of smog events, famously the Great Smog of London, led to estimates of about 12,000 deaths from the smog, and this has ultimately led to the Clean Air Act a few years later, and it means that today our air quality is a lot better than it used to be, but we still see things like this. So that was 2014 in London. That was a dust episode, and I'll come back and talk about that in a second. So we have better air quality nowadays, but it's also changed quite a lot. So the exposure has changed over time, and air pollutants have changed. So older generations are more likely to have been exposed to soot from coal burning and sulfur dioxide from factories. And then, of course, we had the leaded petrol era. Nowadays, diesel engines and NO2, nitrogen dioxide associated with diesels, are more apparent. Ozone in some urban areas is increasing. Carbon monoxide is an indoor air pollutant that we're sort of becoming aware about a lot more. And then if we look into the future and presently, emerging topics would be biomass burning, and that's including wood burners causing local air pollution in the UK. Indoor air has never really got that much attention, although we spend 90% of our time indoors. That's becoming more recognised. And then, of course, the effects of climate change, the interaction with air pollution. Things like forest fires are obviously linked with climate change, and they have quite large effects on air pollution. So the pollutants that we are generally concerned about in the UK today, largely PM2.5, so that's particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns, so fine particles, nitrogen dioxide and ozone. And there are estimates that the long-term exposure to PM2.5 has an effect equivalent to 29,000 deaths a year in the UK. If you include nitrogen dioxide effects, this number could be up to 36,000 deaths, so it's a really significant number. This is a map of NO2 actually from London, and you can just make out that's the Thames there. That's central London. You can see obviously the association with road transport for NO2 and the kind of local effects that you get as well. So long-term effects are things like chronic effects, cancers, and some kind of cardiovascular effects, but there are also short-term effects from air pollution. And so that's things like exacerbation of asthma and respiratory conditions, hospitalisations and even mortality as well. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because I haven't got very long. I'm just going to focus on one. Actually, I'll focus on two examples of short-term air pollution effects. So first of all, quantifying the health impacts from short-term exposure to ozone, and then I'll talk a bit about the what's called the Sahara dust episode 2014. So first of all, this piece of work, the point was to estimate the health impacts of ozone in the UK for present day conditions, and so for present day is actually 2003, and also for future emission scenarios based on 2030. So the maps that you see here are basically show the change in ozone concentration from present day that we would expect if we have, first of all, a high emissions future, current legislation kind of future, or if we have a low emissions future. And then on the right, this is the change in ozone that we would expect if we kept emissions constant but just raised the temperature by 5 degrees. So this is all run using this model here, EMET4UK, and that's run by Edinburgh. And that's a chemistry model that's set up that was run. It was about 5 kilometre resolution, which was enough to get the kind of, you can see the city details as well. So we have these maps of air pollutants, but we need to calculate a health impact. So what we had to do was population weight the concentrations. And this is very important when you have urban-rural differences in lots of pollutants such as ozone and NO2 you saw earlier as well. So typically you have gridded data. So the small squares here represent the grid that the ozone was modelled on, and then you have point data as well. So all these little dots represent the demographic data, and by matching them up then we get an estimate of population weighted exposure. Okay, so we want to calculate the health burden attributable to ozone. And the burden that we're interested in for this study, we were interested in mortality and morbidity. So that's deaths brought forward and respiratory hospital admissions associated with ozone. So we need daily ozone for this, and that comes from the model that I've just shown you. And I've just shown that we applied population weighting. The metric that we used is daily maximum 8-hour ozone. I haven't got much time to go into details, but I'm happy to later. So as well as the exposure, of course, we need to relate the concentration to the response. So, for example, we know there's, from the literature, there's a 0.6% increase in mortality for every 10 ppb parts per billion of ozone, different number for morbidity. And as well as this, we have baseline mortality and morbidity rates, we use population projections to map to 2030. And I'm including this kind of methods because I think I was asked to include a little bit about the spatial, how to resolve spatial data. So based on this methodology, we can see here we've got deaths brought forward for our baseline year, which was 2003. And this number here, so we estimate that around 11,500 people died in 2003 from ozone exposure, short-term exposure to ozone. And as you can see, it's broken down by region. Then we've got on the right, this is the change in mortality based on a 5-degree temperature increase, and then each of our 3 emission scenarios. And then along the bottom, similar calculations for hospital admissions, which are much higher than the mortality. And if you look at this in a different way, you can look at the change in mortality rates for each of the 4 scenarios, broken down again by region, and you can see that the mortality mostly increases, apart from London and the South East, and that's for some atmospheric chemistry reasons, which again I can talk about later, but can't talk about now for time reasons. But generally, that mortality increases even based on the 3 different scenarios in the future. And I'll just finish briefly talking about this event that happened in 2014, and some of you may remember it. It was sort of notable because the air pollution is very visible, basically, and that meant that the newspapers and the media got really interested. And I do remember that when you kind of feel that there was a lot of air pollution in the air. There was a suggestion that it was a Sahara dust event, because a lot of the wind was coming from the Sahara. And I think a lot of the dust did come from the Sahara, but consequent studies have shown that a lot of the pollution was actually just generated locally in Europe, and it was just a combination of weather conditions and normal pollution, although there was some Sahara dust in there as well. But the daily air quality index was high or very high, so the these kind of numbers for different regions, so it wasn't uniform. So we looked regionally to try and calculate the health impacts from this kind of episode of dust. So first of all, we had a look at some observations, and we used daily mean PM2.5. So what's plotted here is 5 years of from January to June, 5 years of data. 2014 is our year of interest, so that's picked out in red here. And the first thing to notice is that this time of year you get lots of peaks in PM2.5, but this one was picked up because it was so visible maybe. But the 2 episodes that we're interested in is this period here and then this period here, and that's when the DACI, the Daily Air Quality Index, was above 4. So we quantified the mortality associated with these 2 little peaks. So we did a health impact assessment similar to before, but we used different models. So this time we used the AQUM, which is the Unified Model, Air Quality Unified Model from the Met Office, slightly different resolution, 12 kilometres. And this is the model that is used for operational air quality forecasts. And then they kind of go back and feed in the observations and create reanalysis data, which is what we used. We population weighted again the exposure and broke it down into region. And again we used exposure response coefficient for short-term effects for PM2.5. And that included mortality, so you get about 1% increase in mortality for every 10 microgram per cubic metre increase. And then also we looked at respiratory hospitalisations and cardiovascular as well. Okay, so the green line here shows the PM2.5 level, broken down by region again. And then the bars show the mortality in red and the morbidity, or the hospitalisations, which are associated with the PM2.5 in this, over this 10-day period, whereas it's two different spikes, but total to 10 days. And again, you can see there's a lot of difference by region, and most of the effects were in the south of the country, really, and much less in the north, and that's largely because a lot of the pollution didn't reach that far. And I'll just summarise with the numbers that we calculated from that work. So we found that we estimated that around 600 deaths were associated with that episode, those two little episodes, so in total over the 10 days. But we also had 1,600 estimated hospital admissions. So this kind of event does put strain on the emergency response and the kind of health service in general. And to put it in context, it's around double what we would expect based on sort of average level of PM2.5. So you can kind of estimate that you might see a twofold increase in acute illness for this kind of event. And I'll just finish on this is the kind of follow-up after the paper was published, and it was kind of reported as in different ways by different papers, as you might expect, but largely picking out the numbers. We killed 300 people in 10 days, and that's kind of what the results showed. But that's all I'll say on that, so thanks very much.
We'll follow that. Thanks for the brief talk, Claire, and we'll follow up with Catherine's presentation.
Spare slots, just keep going.
Okay, so hello, I'm Catherine Yule. I'm a final year DPhil student in epidemiology at the Nuffield Department of Population Health, and my DPhil has been on assessing the health effects of air pollution in China. So for this talk, I'll briefly kind of go through the background of air pollution in China and the kind of medical health effects of that, the lack of evidence in China that then fed into my DPhil project. So, as Claire's kind of highlighted, air pollution, we've got gases and particulates. They tend to be divided within the literature. Nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and ozone, and then you've got the particulate pollution as well. And you have ambient and household air pollution, which is particularly important in China because you've got high prevalence of both of these. But for the purposes of my talk, I'm going to be focusing just on ambient air pollution. So I'll try not to make this too medical, but in terms of the health effects of air pollution, they tend to be kind of grouped into both inflammation, which is both localized in the lungs, as well as systemic inflammation that goes on throughout the wider body. Particulates have been particularly researched and of interest because these are able to pass actually directly into the bloodstream. That can be through either the nasal epithelium in your nose, or there's this part of your kind of upper respiratory tract called the olfactory bulb, where it's been found that very fine particulate matter can pass into the brain. And it can also pass directly into the blood through the alveoli in the lungs down here as well. So it's these kind of medical effects which are really driving the research, the epidemiological research into air pollution in China. So in terms of the sources of air pollution in China, you've got mobile sources and stationary sources, as well as area and natural sources. This is a map of the spatial distribution of air pollution from 2004 to 2013. And you can see that the very high regions up here near Beijing and the Yangtze River Delta region. These kind of lower cities like Guangzhou in southern China, where you've got a lot of port activity and industry, as well as the Sichuan Basin as well, where mountain topography tends to trap the air pollution. Yeah, and my whole presentation seems to have moved slightly, but it'll do. Okay, so we frequently see headlines like this in referral to air pollution, and it's kind of become a bit of a hot topic, especially in China. We see very big numbers like this, 6.1 million deaths, or 7 million deaths, or 1.1 million deaths in China. And I think a lot of people cite these very big numbers specifically in relation to China, but they're not 100% sure where these numbers come from and how they're generated. So I'm briefly going to touch on that. So to generate these numbers, it's done by two separate people, basically the Global Burden Disease and the World Health Organization. Both use their own methodologies for calculating similar but slightly different numbers of deaths in reference to air pollution. And the first kind of step in doing this is you calculate population-weighted mean PM2.5, similar to what Claire described, but on kind of a global level. So you can see here areas like China and India are very high, but Mongolia, where they do still have a lot of PM2.5, is actually very low because compared to China, not very many people live there. So for the purposes of epidemiology, it doesn't really matter that much. We then take estimates for the effects of PM2.5 on health. And they basically do some very complex maths and generate this, what they call an integrated exposure response curve. And this takes studies, or applying studies, that have looked at the effects of PM2.5. And for each of these studies, you get a risk estimate of the effect of that on health. So they've taken the foremost kind of established health outcomes in reference to air pollution, which is ischemic heart disease, stroke, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. And they plot these risk estimates with PM2.5 on the bottom and then the predicted risk on the y-axis. And they use kind of a Bayesian approach to simulate over these risk estimates, and you get this kind of nice, smooth curve. From this, they then take these and calculate the population attributable fraction, which is the proportion of the outcome of interest, so in this case deaths, which can be attributed to this ambient air pollution exposure, which they get from this map and combined with the risk estimates. From this, they then can calculate the disease burden for each relevant risk factor. However, a significant issue here is that if you refer to the map, the areas with the highest population-weighted exposure tend to be in low middle-income countries, principally China and India. None of these studies were performed in China or India or any LMICs. These ones that look at ambient air pollution are all performed within regions such as Western Europe and North America. And these ones up here, where you get extremely high PM2.5 concentrations, were actually taken from studies on active smoking to get an estimate of that risk. Obviously, active smoking is not really comparable to outdoor air pollution in China, but I'm just going to go with it for the purposes of the epidemiology. So obviously there's a huge lack of studies within China and India, and that's the reason why they haven't yet been included. And you get this kind of gap at like 100 to 300, which is kind of typical PM2.5 levels in China, but there's no studies on it to kind of feed these estimates for research purposes. So, oh wow, that's really moved. Cue my DPhil, which I am looking at the short and long-term health effects of air pollution in China. Short-term health effects in LMICs tends to use time series or case crossover studies, which is where we look at the population as a whole, and we look at the temporal fluctuation in air pollution, and in a simplistic explanation, we then correlate that to the temporal fluctuation in deaths. So if air pollution spiked yesterday in Oxford, how many deaths today could we say were attributed to that spike? For long-term health effects, it's a bit different. We look at the spatial variation of air pollution across participants as individuals. And these are kind of seen as the more reliable studies, and these are the studies which feed those curves that I just showed you for the prediction of deaths. So we predict individual air pollution concentrations. We then feed that into a statistical model which gives individual level risk for specific diseases. So my research is using the China Kuduri Biobank, which was a biobank set up in Oxford. It's got 500,000 Chinese adults aged 35 to 74 at baseline. It's the biggest prospective study ever done in China. We've got baseline survey questionnaire, physical measurements, blood samples, inflammatory markers, everything. And then both morbidity and mortality are followed up via death and disease registries, as well as health insurance, which covers 98% of our participants. We also have periodic resurveys every 5 years. The China Kuduri Biobank consists of 5 urban and 5 rural regions, from the freezing north and top of near Harbin down to the tropical south in Haikou. For the purposes of my research, I was just focusing on urban regions because it's where we have ambient air pollution data available. So the first part of my DPhil was to look at the short-term health effects in the China Kuduri Biobank. And yes, we do have 500,000 participants, which for a cohort study is massive. It doesn't quite compare with some of the other studies that are emerging. This one done in America had 60 million participants, and then you've got ones from China with 200 million, 7 million. Like, these studies are huge, so we couldn't really compete on this level. But one way that we could compete is that because the China Kuduri Biobank, we collect individual level information, we've got their baseline characteristics, their health data, all that kind of thing. We could kind of tailor this to a more individual level approach. So we then did this to look at whether or not pre-existing disease has any kind of effect on the susceptibility to short-term fluctuations in air pollution. So this graph, which is really moved, I'll try and explain it. So these are 2 CKD regions. You've got Suzhou on the left and Luzhou on the right. And first-time cardiovascular disease cases, this lag is the number of days. So day 0, that's the increase. Today, 1, 2, 3, 4 are the following days after that subsequent increase. So this is a 10 microgram increase in PM2.5. You can see that in Suzhou, it's associated with roughly a 2.1% increase in cardiovascular disease readmissions. So that's people who have already been diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, and this is just causing exacerbation of a condition. Whereas in Luzhou, we saw that there was kind of roughly a 3% increase in first-time cardiovascular disease cases for a 10 microgram increase in PM2.5. So we could kind of gauge from this that increases in air pollution, short-term increases in air pollution in China are having an effect on both first-time and recurring cardiovascular disease events. There are numerous difficulties with air pollution epidemiology in comparison to things like studies on smoking or BMI. The first is that pollutants are highly correlated, so if you've got high PM2.5, you'll probably have high PM10 and nitrogen dioxide, and so it's really difficult to isolate those specific pollutant effects, because if they're correlated, you can't put them in the same model. Any findings that we find in epidemiology will just demonstrate an association. We can't, without a randomized control trial, demonstrate cause and effect. So we cannot say that air pollution is causing this many number of deaths. Confounding factors are a big issue, so those are issues that are associated with the disease that you're looking at, but they also correlate in relation to air pollution. So an example of that would be socioeconomic status, we know affects people's in terms of heart disease and respiratory disease, and people who are poor might live near more polluted areas. And finally, exposure assessment is ecological. Even in studies where we do assign individual level exposure, it's not truly individual, it's usually modelled using geographical models, and we can't account for their time activity or the time they spend indoors or outdoors. So it is still kind of an ecological aspect. So bearing that in mind, these are, wow, okay, this is really, these are the findings for the long-term health effects in the China Kudori Biobank. I'm going to try and explain this awkward plot. The bottom is a hazard ratio. A hazard ratio of 1 is there is no difference between the exposed and the unexposed. A hazard ratio of 1.5 is you've got 50% excess risk if you're exposed compared to when you're unexposed. A hazard ratio of 0.82 shows that you have 18% reduced risk if you're exposed to when you're unexposed. And these black squares are just in the inverse of the variance, so that's just showing how confident we are in the estimate. But from this, it would lead us to believe that if you're in haiku and you're exposed to PM2.5, you are 18% less likely to develop cardiovascular disease, which is obviously, hopefully, not true, and my Bibles will be gone. But yeah, so for this we used annual time-varying PM2.5, which we assigned to participants, which we got from collaborators in China and also NASA. And this was kind of assigned as an annually varying time-varying variable. So every year that moved forward in time, the PM kind of corresponded with that. And we assigned it to 167,000 participants. It's the largest cohort study of its kind in air pollution that's ever been done in China, so the results aren't particularly ideal. But going back to what I said about how difficult air pollution epidemiology is, confounding must be controlled, and there's always the likely presence of residual confounding, so that's confounding that we couldn't address. So in this case, possible examples could be urban development. This study started in 2008 and ended in 2016. So as cities develop, PM2.5 goes up, but people's health as cities develop will also improve. So that's kind of an example of residual confounding that we haven't yet been able to address. And then there's major things like smoking. We did adjust for smoking, but it's always down as a residual confounder because of its correlation with air pollution and effect on health. Again, pollutants can co-vary significantly, which PM2.5 could just be highly correlated with another pollutant that we haven't been able to measure. And exposure assessment is still ecological, so here we assigned PM2.5 to participants based on their clinic location, which is when, at the start of the cohort study, all participants go to a clinic for registration and completion of the baseline questionnaire. They do live within 1 kilometre of these clinics, but it's still not as ideal as having their residential address or even their individual PM2.5 levels. So that could be another potential explanation. So, kind of in conclusion, air pollution remains a considerable global risk factor for disease, particularly in LMICs such as China. We found that short-term increases of air pollution in China are associated with both healthy and disease-free individuals. Quantified estimates on numbers of deaths attributable to air pollution in China within LMICs should be interpreted with caution because they're not as objective and accurate, I think, as most people often understand them to be, and much more research is needed on the long-term health effects of air pollution in LMICs, such as China, but also India, because that is emerging as a new country with a lot of air pollution. Let's see.
Thank you, Catherine, for that nice, lovely talk. Sorry about the movement of all the
don't worry,
different things. Yeah. So now we'll conclude the presentations with Andy Holland's talks, and then we'll move on to the Q&A from there.
Is this you?
No. Okay. Yeah. So this is the next segue. As we've, learned that there's a strong link between air pollution exposure and health. And I'm an urban planner by trade. So my role is to translate this scientific knowledge into something that can be, actually implemented in policy and planning. And some of the stuff that I looked at is air pollution, not because air pollution is important for health, but because air pollution, there's some sort of a pessimistic view that we can't really do anything about air pollution. It's something else, someone else's hand. So, but I want to make sure that this is sort of a myth that we all have. So I'm going to talk about this roadway closure and implications for urban air quality management. And this is the picture of an event called the Carmageddon. People sort of celebrated the roadway closure. This is the humongous highway in Los Angeles. And one guy went there and took this picture, the planking picture. So thought it was quite interesting. To start off, I want to address some of these myths about urban air quality. And it sort of aligns well with what Claire and Catherine have talked about, but it's incorporated some of the new scientific knowledge that we've been accumulating. So the first myth is that people tend to think that we can rank cities by air quality. So you've seen a lot of news articles like, okay, China and India is worst worst country to live versus the Denmark or the Netherlands or cleanest city. I think that's sort of an aggregate picture of what air quality does to our health. And although there is some ranking going on at the aggregate level, if you look at the city level, if you look at neighborhood level, the air quality varies. So that's a myth that we have to overcome. The second myth is that the air quality is bad if you can see it. It's certainly true for things like smoke or sand dust. You can actually see and you can smell. But oftentimes nowadays, air quality, mostly in developing countries, high-income countries, air quality has improved significantly. So just the small particles in the air can cause a lot of trouble, and you can't even see it. So the third, there's sort of a pessimistic view about air quality. There's nothing we can do about it. We can press the government, we can talk to the policymakers. But how can we do? I'm an individual. I bike every day. But and then there's some sort of a pessimistic understanding about air quality. But that's the myth that we have to overcome. So this picture shows the London air quality hotspots. Like I said, you can't really rank cities by air quality because of these gradient effect of air quality. So this is the London central city, London. If you zoom in to the neighborhood level, you can see that there's a huge variations in terms of air quality. It really matters where you live. If you live right next to roads, if you live right next to highways, you get huge air pollution. Versus if you're far away, if you're walking in this high park, then you're less likely to be exposed to air quality, air pollution problem. So there's this huge variations within country and within city and within neighborhoods. So some parts of the in the London neighborhoods, in terms of air quality, some parts of the neighborhoods are worse in terms of air quality compared to some cities in Delhi or some cities in China. The second myth about the air quality, I can see it, and it's a problem if I can see it. The problem is air quality when it comes to particulate matter, especially PM 2.5 and PM 10. Claire and Catherine talked about it. It's really, really tiny. So this is the human hair, and PM 2.5 is about 20 times smaller than human hair. So it's really, really small, and it's basically invisible. And the scientific knowledge, what we're finding is that the smaller, the worse. So what we're finding is an ultrafine particle, which is less than 0.1 micrometer. It's causing all kinds of problems. It gets in your lung, it gets into your brain, it gets into your bloodstreams. So those little particles, you can't really see them, but it penetrates inside to your bloodstream. That causes a lot of problems. So can we do anything about this? Well, in modern society, transportation accounts for, is the biggest contributor to air pollution. About 25%, comes from, transportation-related air pollution. And as you can see, this is a typical, I-405 highway in Los Angeles. It's basically like bumper to bumper. It's like a parking lot, and it creates a lot of exhaust, a lot of fumes, including PM2.5, PM10, quantifying particles, using particles. Typical, big street in LA. There are cars everywhere. So these cars, if you can get rid of those cars, can we have better air quality? Well, the answer is not this simple, but we can try. So this shows the Carmageddon in 2011 actually. Los Angeles, they closed down the 10-mile section of I-405 highway in Los Angeles for construction. But people sort of celebrated that this is, before it was called Armageddon, car plus Armageddon. So Carmageddon, people were afraid that we're going to be stuck in traffic. The media pictured it as the worst day ever to experience for Los Angeles people. But it actually turned out, to be pretty nice, and it, actually increased air quality. Ciclavia, I don't know if you've heard about the car-free streets, open streets initiatives, and things about that. You probably know that. So the Ciclavia, they closed down the street on one weekends in Los Angeles, and people basically celebrated this car-free streets. So I've looked at these two cases, and I studied whether these two cases, this exclusion of traffic, can actually improve air quality. So the car plus Armageddon, this is the Carmageddon that I'm going to talk about. So this is Los Angeles, just in case you don't know. So this is the 10-mile section of freeway that was closed for 2 days. And Metro, the transit authority in Los Angeles, used this message of fear to distract people from driving that day. So this is the worst day ever to drive. And the media pictured it as this is the last day to drive. So actually, people were afraid that they're going to stuck in traffic. So that really worked. And I looked at the regional air quality monitors, before and after, before and during and after the event, and it turns out that there was a 14% reduction in traffic regionally, and this is all regional figures, and 16% reduction, 33% reduction in PM2.5, and ozone showed 16% reduction regionally. So this is a very striking reduction in terms of magnitude of the size, because it's a regional level. You can actually have a really big impact even if you just close down 2 days, only just a section of the street. You can have a ripple impact at the regional level. So this shows the traffic flows on I-405, and the darker the color means the more reduction in terms of traffic. And you can see that this is the air pollution monitoring sites in Los Angeles. There was a huge reduction ranging from 20 to 40 and averaging to 16% reduction overall during the day when the Carmageddon happened. So this is great. So you can actually turn that, close down all those streets, and we're going to have, clean air. But it's not really simple. As you can see, this is the typical day, weekends, sort of air pollution trends, and this is the Carmageddon day air pollution trends in terms of ozone. So some of these are very time sensitive. There's a temporal trend. So like I said, this is not just an aggregate picture, but there's a dynamic nature in terms of how the air pollution interacts with the environment. So when it comes to NO2, it's kind of interesting that actually the air pollution on this site actually increased during the Carmageddon event. So the ozone reduced, but NO2 in some parts of the city actually increased. There could be two reasons. One is there were a lot of construction diesel running vehicles on those sites. So that might have contributed to this, the increase in NO2 near the construction sites. And the other reason is that in the literature, the ozone and NO2, they have some sort of inverse relationship. It comes to the chemical, understanding of the ozone and NO2. The O3, if you reduce ozone, the oxygen part can be actually integrated into, it combines with nitrates and creates this photochemical reaction that creates NO2. So there's sort of an inverse relationship. If you decrease ozone, that actually turns out it could actually increase NO2. So there is this complex relationship between different particles, different air pollutants, and if you just close down the street, you're not going to see the overall impact of air pollution. You're going to see some air pollutants decrease, some air pollutants increase. And this is sort of the overarching theme of my research that I'm finding, not just in the regional study, but also at the local study, which I'm going to talk about. So ciclavia, it looks like Los Angeles people like to coin these different terms. Ciclavia plus LA is the ciclavia. So ciclavia is actually car-free day that started in the 1970s in Bogota. And it spread around the world, and it became really popular over the past about 10 years. And there are over 90 open streets in North America. There are over 300 car-free days events worldwide. There's actually one that's going to happen in London in September 22nd. And I'm part of this sort of organizing committee as well. So hopefully sort of my knowledge, my understanding about air quality can be helpful in terms of organizing that event. So Ciclavia is actually an open streets event. And it was actually not meant to be for sort of air quality improvement or air quality management strategy, but we looked at as an opportunity to see if the closure of the local street or a certain section of the local streets can have an impact on air pollution. So we measured the air quality before, during, and after the Ciclavia. It's very much similar to what we've done in the Carmageddon study, but this actually employs the actual people who actually went out and measured at the ground level. So it was a collaboration with nonprofits and citizen volunteers behind the Ciclavia event. You can see a lot of people participated in this study. They did a survey and they helped out measuring the air pollution on the ground level. So this shows the neighborhood mobile sampling campaign that we've done as part of the study. This shows the mobile platform. It captures air quality, all kinds of different particles, PM2.5, PM10, NO2, CO, and also diesel particles. So we fitted all these the devices and drove around the Ciclavia event sites. And then we also had this backpack instruments with the same set of devices, much more mobile devices. So it creates this sort of a ground level understanding of the air quality before, during, and after the event. And this is the results of the PM10 and ultrafine particles. So PM10 is relatively larger size particles compared to ultrafine, which is a very, very tiny little particles. So they sort of vary, sort of have a different behavior in terms of how they disperse in the air. So during the event, PM10 levels decrease overall, as you can see. So this is the mobile sample, the results. But UFP, ultrafine particles, actually increase during the event. So there could be two explanations. One is that this cyclavia event actually, served as a traffic magnet. A lot of people got confused. There were a lot of, the detours. There were a lot of traffic along this, the traffic, the cyclavia event site. So even though the traffic was excluded in the main road, which translated into reduction of larger particles nearby, but the smaller particles stayed up in the air because of the congestion created around this event site. And secondly, through our survey, it turns out that 40 to 50% of our participants to the event, they drove their cars to the event. So imagine that you have a lot of traffic here, and people try to join the event, try to park around, the event site. It created, had a combined effect of increasing the air pollution. So the larger particles, like road dose and PM10 levels, you see the reduction. But the very small particles that are driven by all these traffic actually increase during the event. So the implications for air quality management is that larger reduction in traffic is more effective than a smaller reduction, like you've seen in cyclavia. So that you can actually trump all these other, the factors that are going in. But more importantly, there needs to be a more careful planning in consideration of these human factors like psychology and behavior, how people respond to the event, how people, plan their journey. So some of the things like, strategies to sort of, mitigate some of these impact of air pollution during the cyclavia event could be, why don't we, if you're part of participating in this event, why don't we just, give up your car and ride your bike all the way to the event, or ride transit. So the metro or the transit authorities need to think carefully about how to, plan this event holistically rather than looking at the event itself. So that's some of the implications that I have. And I would like to end my talk with this very inspiring news articles about 13 cities that are starting to ban cars, which includes Oslo, that broke the news last week. So a lot of the cities are thinking about this, how to reduce air quality more systematically. And this could be one way. We can just bar cars that goes into the city center, and if it can translate into huge benefits, both physically for health and also for the mental health and well-being, this could be something that we can consider. So this ends my talk, and I think we're gonna move on to the panel discussion.
So we'll quickly turn off the projector so that we don't blind the ghosts. Or,
Turn the power on?
I think is there a button on the
Yeah, there's a button right back.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I guess if the panelists stand up, we can move you to the center.
All right.
Thanks for each of your talks. They were all quite. I didn't really know that much about about air pollution based on, because my background is mostly on solar panels, so it was interesting to have this kind of talk. I guess some questions I had were for Claire specifically. You talked a little bit about the about like the kind of air chemistry there was, and as kind of I have a more chemical background, so I was interested in kind of how you end up with that kind of, or what kinds of air chemistry there are that causes the kind of that causes some kinds of reductions in air pollution that you mentioned in your talk. And Catherine, I guess maybe for a talk on or for preparation for your Viva, I was wondering kind of how you might go about addressing some of those residual confounding points, and maybe also if you think it's, or how we might go about getting the kind of like deep level of data that you had in the data set that you were working with. How might we go about getting that in other areas or in other low and middle income countries? And then I guess for my question for Andy was whether or not or you have any recommendations based on what you learned from the Ciclavia event in LA, how you would use that to improve the event that you're helping with in London. Yes. So yeah.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, the ozone is the sort of most interesting in terms of chemistry. And as Andy said, there's a relationship between nitrogen dioxide, or NOx, as well, and ozone. So actually, ozone has a quite slow reaction time, so it kind of builds up slowly. Nitrogen dioxide is released from traffic, and actually nitrogen dioxide in some regimes will destroy ozone. So the interesting thing about the modelling, so if you have to imagine those maps, when you have a high emissions future, that means that we see more nitrogen dioxide and more cars. But that actually means that ozone gets destroyed. So there are benefits for ozone. So the interesting thing about the results was the high emission future actually saw reductions in ozone, but that's counteracted by the fact that nitrogen dioxide levels are high. So, and the other thing about nitrogen dioxide is that it's extremely local. So, like the highway example, that you might not see, as you didn't see, the reduction because maybe as soon as you move away from the road, basically the level will drop off. Whereas ozone is often it's generally higher in rural areas because it's not being destroyed by nitrogen dioxide. And the seasonal cycle, the daily cycle in ozone is driven by the sun, basically, because ozone is helped along by the sun. So I guess, sorry to go on a bit. So the important thing is that if you just look at one air pollutant in isolation, then the health impacts of ozone may be improved by a really polluted future, but that's obviously going to be counteracted by nitrogen dioxide. And particulates are less, there's less chemistry, although there is some chemistry with aerosols and interactions like that.
So in terms of the first part of your question, reference to my Viva, it's going to be fun, but I think the whole problem with residual confounding is the fact that it is residual. These are things that we just simply cannot address easily with the data that we have within the cohort. One potential option that we're currently exploring is to split follow-up time. So we follow our participants from 2008 to 2016. If we were to split that into essentially two different studies, so to speak, so you've got the first period and the second period, are these associations consistent throughout that, or is it maybe in the later period that it's just become protective because that's when development has increased significantly? In terms of the second part of your question on cohorts in other LMICs,
Yeah.
is that it? Yeah, so the air pollution data that we use is aerosol optical depth, which they've now got across the whole world. So if you have a cohort in an LMIC, you've essentially got the air pollution data ready to go. It's just setting up these big cohort studies, which are really challenging and a lot of work. We've got a team in our department that are exploring some in Cuba and Mexico and Russia as well, but it takes kind of decades to get these results. With cohort studies, you kind of, if you were to set one up now, to get enough data to get these kind of associations, you'd be waiting for about 10, 15 years. So it is a lot of work, it takes a lot of motivation. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Andy, you're...
Yeah. So I guess I'm sort of lucky that actually the founder of London Car Free Day approached me and see if I'd be interested in doing some kind of sort of panel discussion like this, and I said yes because that's the way that I can actually help them or improve how they approach the event, because we oftentimes think that if you remove traffic from the road, you will think that you're going to have a lot of improvement in air quality, and that's sort of the mentality going on with a lot of car-free street event. People, organizers, are sort of making it, advertising it as like this is for health and well-being. We're going to change the world sort of mentality, but there's this little caveat. So if you're just focusing on the event, it's nothing more than just the big, large sporting events like a soccer game or baseball game. But if you think about it in terms of, okay, this is a way to get us into healthier cities, if you craft a message around that, you can actually convince people to give up driving. And actually, if you're not just focusing on the fun part, you have to think about these other benefits while we're doing this. And I think London is a very good place to instill this kind of message, because a lot of people are concerned about air quality. And they actually see, a lot of people see the links between, okay, if we remove cars, will we benefit in terms of air quality? If you could craft a message around that and do some kind of social marketing, and work with the city government to try to implement both carrots and sticks in terms of actually switching mode from car to more cleaner, healthier transportation mode, like walking, biking, and transit, then you can actually create a momentum in terms of how we understand and the impact of transportation on air quality, and it could actually could have a ripple impact in terms of getting us into more radical idea about implementing this at the city level, the car-free sort of initiative that a lot of European countries are spearheading. And I think that the message is really important. If you're just thinking about it, it's just a fun event, come and join, I don't think it's going to work, because people will expect it's going to be fun and everything. People are not going to think about all these other aspects. So if you craft that idea, craft the message around this is for health, this is for well-being, we're going to have to think about more holistic about our journey and how we behave, how we choose our transportation mode, which is our basically our daily decision planning.
Cool. Thanks. So do we have any questions in the audience? No. All right. Excellent. So we'll start with Phil.
Yeah, so is the issue with cars in cities mostly due to the fact that they're internal combustion engine powered, or is there a more fundamental issue with cars compared to, say, cycling or walking?
Okay. I'm going to hold that, and then you had a question as well?
I had a question for Andy really quickly. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I know that everybody there is extremely reliant on on cars. Like LA County is like 4,000 square miles. It's very difficult to get around like without a car because our public transportation sucks as well. So keeping that in mind, like what do you think is a practical timeline for a city like that to actually start implementing the policy changes that won't like cause social rupture?
And there's one more from Tom, although I suspect it might be from online.
Well, so we have one from online, which I'll ask first, and then I've got two that I'll ask myself.
Okay.
So
Ask
this is-
one of them and then we'll get back
Yeah,
to it.
sure. So this is from Kai in Cambridge. Andy, as you mentioned, the outdoor air quality would vary from different neighbourhoods in a city. Would you elaborate more on this variation? That was from Kai. And then my question was, I guess, a bit, particularly towards Catherine. Are PM 2.5 all made equal in terms of their health effect? Because I wonder if the kind of effect from PM 2.5 from like the Taklamakan or Sahara, is that going to be as bad, and particularly in terms of the chronic health effects, is something which is maybe a little bit more toxic than passenger?
So, does anyone? Or,
Well, I can take a stab. I mean, I'm not an expert on combustion engines, some of you guys are. But I mean, I think in terms of the combustion engine, we achieved a lot in terms of cleaning the air. The catalytic converter, for example, the removing lead from. It helped in terms of removing lead in the air, and there's a study that sort of correlates with the start of the combustion engine, and then the crime rates sort of dropped. So, and this is a correlation, but the catalytic converter and the conversion engine does have a role in terms of the urban air quality, but I think it's a sort of a long-term strategy going forward. But I guess the short-term strategy, from an individual's point of view, is both you can avoid being exposed to high levels of air pollution, but also you can actually contribute to cleaning the air by changing your mode on a daily basis. So those two things, sometimes they clash each other, because if you're biking and walking a lot, you're more likely to be exposed to a lot of air pollution. But if there's a critical mass that can be achieved, like just ban the car all at once at the city level, I think that could have a very large impact in terms of the magnitude.
Yeah, so to sort of build on that, so in terms of air quality, the combustion engine is the key factor, and nitrogen dioxide being a large component of diesel. But as the sort of engines become cleaner, and so things like electric vehicles, obviously much lower emissions, and although they're powered by power stations, power stations are removed generally a little bit outside of cities. But as you get less emissions from the tailpipe, you start to see particulate, well, not more particulates, but the percentage of pollution is more importantly coming from brakes and things like that, so just particles that come off the vehicles.
do you want to address
In reference to your question, no, they're definitely not all created equal. If you inhale fine particulate matter from the Sahara or from urban China, ultimately they will both be treated as kind of foreign bodies in the bloodstream and will trigger an inflammatory response, which can lead to kind of these acute health outcomes like heart attack, stroke, things like that. But if you're looking at more chronic health outcomes, especially things like lung cancer doesn't develop unless something is a carcinogen. So in order to kind of associate fine particulate matter with lung cancer, you need to kind of assume that these very fine particles have some carcinogenic properties, and some of their chemical constituents have now been listed as carcinogenic.
And I think that's exactly right, but it's so difficult to separate the effects. So obviously we think that some particles are more toxic than others, but you can only measure the whole. So things like there are some studies on black carbon. You probably know them. So sometimes if black carbon is shown to have a certain effect, but it's impossible to kind of break it all down.
Yeah, so in the recent Lancet article, probably know, Catherine, so they did a comparison, case crossover study looking at the sample, the actual people who walk on busy urban streets in London versus Hyde Park. And they measure the air quality and also the exposure, and then the lung function level, and some of the other biometrics. And they found that the smaller the particles, the more detrimental effect on health. So like ultrafine particles, the diesel particles were the ones that come out quite significant in terms of the health effects. So the different types of pollutants matter, and like I presented in my the talk, not necessarily the ones that you feel and see are the most dangerous one, but the ones that are invisible are probably the most dangerous one in terms of health. And responding to your question about the viable strategy, I think each city has different strategies. The LA in particular, the urban design, urban form itself, there's a sunk cost in terms of how we design our city. So that really boils down to the fact that we've built our city in a way that's practically impossible to live without a car. And I'm not saying that LA is not doing great in terms of investing, transit infrastructure and all that, but it's just really hard to achieve a viable, to come up with a viable solution because of the urban environment, because of the urban form that has been created for the past 50 years. Versus London or in other parts of the European countries, it's easier because of this urban form, because of the better infrastructure that's put in place, and it all comes down to this combination of different policies and planning, and also the sort of the carrots and sticks that goes into regulating travel behavior. So there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, but each city has its own strategies and planning, and LA, compared to other cities in UK or in Europe, has a long way to go in terms of implementing those policies and strategies.
Cool. Do we have one more round of questions, I guess, then? So we've got a question here, John.
Okay, so mine's for Andy, and you mentioned that you issued a survey, and then at the end of the event, and I'm just wondering if you had any questions in there that would allow you to approach the kind of psychological mechanisms in terms of whether people perceive this inconsistency, in their traveling by car and so on, but also whether people saw it maybe as like a one-day thing and then will go back to normal, or whether it would actually lead them to change their behavior more in the long term.
I'd like to ask a question about scale, so both time scales and spatial scales. And I guess I'm just wondering, within measurement modeling and perhaps also epidemiology, how you deal with the fact that a lot of these things have different lifetimes in the atmosphere, and they vary on such different scales. We're talking meters compared to kilometers or hundreds of kilometers. That's just generally anyone that wants to speak on that.
And I think there was one more question about that.
So a few questions, but you can pick whichever one you want. So for Catherine, in your last sort of diagram, Ujo was all the way sort of to the right. Do you have any ideas as to why, based on some of the stuff that you mentioned in terms of city design and cities coming up? For Claire, are there any regulations being put into place to actually reduce the amount of crap that's getting, from the industrial side, to reduce the amount of crap that's actually getting, put into the atmosphere in terms of, the materials actually using to build this stuff? And then for Andy, for Carmageddon, did you look at the health effects, a la what Claire looked at? Because that would have been for an extended period of time, so, yeah.
Cool. So, I guess.
I wouldn't mind talking about Scott's question about the scale. So,
yeah.
so I think something that it's very important that when obviously you're doing the epidemiology and the epidemiological studies are derived from observations or models of air pollution, and then when you apply the epidemiological coefficients to the exposure data, they need to be on the same scale. So that's why I mentioned that the metric that we use for ozone, for example, is the most related to health impact is the 8-hour daily mean maximum. So it is very important to match the scales. So PM 2.5 generally is done on a daily mean for health effects. Nitrogen dioxide has a short-term effect, so like hourly or 15 minutes, but annual for long-term effects. So and that's one point about the modelling. For things like NO2, you saw where the roads are on that model. If you had a 10-kilometre grid across the city, you wouldn't see, you wouldn't capture the NO2. So if you want to look at NO2, you have to really model very small scale, and it's a little bit difficult.
Yeah, so for Lujo at the very far right, it is a slightly older population relative to the other three cities, which could be a potential reason. It also has slightly higher PM 2.5, although not by much, so I'm not sure whether that would be a contributing reason, but it's definitely something we do need to look into. But kind of the first step before we go looking at individual cities is to see whether these effects are even reliable in the first place, I think.
And
to respond to your question about psychology, it's a very important factor that a lot of the planning agencies or NGOs are sort of not really looking into. We did measure some questions about, are you willing to participate in the event again? We measured their daily sort of patterns of physical activity, whether they walk or bike. And it oftentimes, people are sort of self-selected to those events. So almost 2/3 of our participants were biking and walking for commute. So I guess the context is also in LA. So it's very sort of a quintessential auto-based city. And to do some kind of events like this, there's a lot of pushback in terms of doing this car-free day thing, because people see it as a new, annoyance. Radical people just close down the streets, and biking and walking. People see it as like a hippie sort of a movement. But a lot of the young generations, the millennials, they get it, because a lot of them don't have cars. A lot of them are really into this sort of climate change dialogue, whether or not the top leadership is going forward or not. But people really get, the young generations really get this concept and get the urgency of the problem. So the psychological sort of thing that you can actually think about is, you can think of this Ciclavia or Car-Free Day or Open Streets event as a taste of gold. So if you're not really into that kind of thing, it will sort of get you on the hook first, and then oftentimes people love it, even if you're not really into that kind of car-free event. People just generally like the idea of having no cars on the streets whatsoever, and just being able to freely roam around. It's a very empowering experience if you've ever done it. So it creates this positive effect psychologically. So even if you're not really into biking and walking, you can actually give them a taste of gold. This is something you can do on a daily basis, right? And that can actually, turn into something that's meaningful to change people's behavior. So this getting into this psychology, being able to understand how people respond, being able to craft a message around health and well-being is a very important issue for all kinds of, all these type of car-free, open streets initiatives.
Cool.
And responding to your question about health, fortunately we didn't measure health, partly because it's just only 2-day event, 2-day incident that happened, and the assumption that goes into that is 2 days is not enough to see a huge health effects. Maybe the 10 days, the duration, with the Sahara dust, maybe that that translates into health effects. But just 2 days being able to see health effects, it's almost impossible. So it will be interesting to look at some of these bigger initiatives, like what's done in Oslo and other parts of the European cities. Just close down, the ban cars into the city and see how that translates to health effects. Will be really interesting. And some of these ultra, LEZ policies that London is implementing, being able to look at the health impact of those could really drive the policy, the shift in terms of how we actually implement this.
Yeah, there is some work in, so they're introducing the low emission zone in London, the extra one. There's quite a lot of modelling work on that, because one of the concerns is that it simply will move the, you can't drive into a certain area, but that means a lot of people drive around that area, which is not great. And yeah, so there's lots of work on that, basically. And there's also impacts on people who are poorer, who might be worse affected by this. So there's lots of impacts on that. Cool.
All right, then I think what we'll do is we'll wrap it up there. So give me more help in thanking the speakers again.
So thank you all again for attending our seminar. So we just want to give a big thanks to Dan Gregory, who put this entire event together. I think wine reception just outside. Okay. So if you have any other questions you want to ask the speakers, they're going to be here. So feel free to stick around, and there will be wine and nibbles outside, just outside this lecture room. Thank you.
I did know.
Just right around the corner.
I went like 2 weeks ago.